Hello everybody, I'm Miss Jessica from EVPL McCullough, and today we are going to be continuing our chapter book story time, and it is our variety pack, so we are trying out all kinds of different genres. And I'm so sorry, I had to cheat last time. We had yet to get this genre. Every time I used our Plinko board, it was not landing on it, and we'd already had a couple of genres multiple times, and this one we hadn't gotten to yet. So I did cheat a little bit last time so that we could get to fantasy. I even wore my unicorn sweater in honor of that. So because it is a fantasy book, I'm trying to set the mood a little bit. I do have my snuggly blanket. Harper is right here. You can kind of see her maybe on the camera. She will probably pop up here in just a bit. I do want to tell you that my allergies are definitely acting up, so I do have something nearby to drink in case I start coughing. I have a cough drop. But here is our fantasy book that we are going to be reading. It is A Tale, Dark and Grim by Adam Gidwitz. Now, if you have heard of Grimm's fairy tales, that is connected to this book. Now, there were two brothers that put together a book of fairy tales, and as the years have gone by, they have been turned into lots of different variations, whether it's books or movies or other stories in some way. Now, I will tell you before we even read the first cover, the first page, anything, and this will be introduced into the book very, very early on, that fairy tales, the original fairy tales, are actually pretty violent and maybe not so nice. So if that is not something that you are interested in listening to or reading, that is okay. Definitely skip this time and join us next Friday when we will be reading a different book. And that is the wonderful thing about reading, is that you can always, if you are not enjoying something, go to something else. Don't keep reading a book if you are not enjoying it just so that you can finish it. You don't have to know the ending, especially if it's not something that you actually are enjoying. If somebody says, read this book, it's amazing, and it's just not for you, don't read it. Pick what you like. That's the whole point of this chapter book story time, is that we're trying to introduce you to a lot of different things. And this one, if you are not into violence, if you are not into blood and different things like that, this might not be for you, because already on the cover of the book, you can see she has a sword and it has blood on it. So something is going to go down that, you know, might be a little too grown up for you. Okay, so let's see what the inside cover has to say. Reader, beware. Warlocks with dark spells, hunters with deadly aim, and bakers with ovens retrofitted for cooking children lurk within these pages. But if you dare, turn the page and learn the true story of Hansel and Gretel, the story behind and beyond the breadcrumbs, edible houses, and outwitted witches. Come on in. It may be frightening, it's certainly bloody, and it's definitely not for the faint of heart. But unlike those other fairy tales, you know, this one is true. Okay, so A Tale, Dark and Grim. And here is kind of the front cover again, but you can definitely see there is a dragon. There are some that look like little kind of goblins or wood sprites, and definitely kind of sets the atmosphere. And as you're going through the story, one other thing that I do want to point out is that it does have some really great, not quite illustrations, but just kind of decorations on the page that make it just kind of set that mood also. So definitely enjoying the look of this book, kind of the feel of this book. So let's get started. Once upon a time, fairy tales were awesome. I know. You don't believe me. I don't blame you. A little while ago, I wouldn't have believed it myself. Little girls in red caps skipping through the forest. Awesome? I don't think so. But then I started to read them. The real grim ones. Very few little girls in red caps in those. Well, there's one, but she gets eaten. Okay, you're probably saying, if fairy tales are awesome, why are all the ones I've heard so unbelievably mind-numbingly boring? You know how it is with stories. Someone tells a story, then somebody repeats it and it changes, somebody else repeats it and it changes again. Then someone's telling it to their kid and taking out all the scary, bloody scenes. In other words, the awesome parts. And then next thing you know, the story's about an adorable little girl in a red cap skipping through the forest to take cookies to her granny. And you're so bored. You've passed out on the floor. The real Grimm stories are not like that. Take Hansel and Gretel, for example. Two greedy little children try to eat a witch's house, so she decides to cook and eat them instead. Which is fair, it seems to me. But before she can follow through on her perfectly reasonable plan, they lock her in an oven and bake her to death. Which is pretty cool, you have to admit. But maybe it's not awesome. Except, and here's the thing, that's not the real story of Hansel and Gretel. You see, there is another story in Grimm's fairy tales, a story that winds all the way throughout that moldy, mysterious tome, like a trail of breadcrumbs winding through a forest. It appears in tales you may have never heard of, like Faithful Johannes and Brother and Sister, and in some that you have, Hansel and Gretel, for instance. It is the story of two children, a girl named Gretel and a boy named Hansel, traveling through a magical and terrifying world. It is the story of two children striving and failing and then not failing. It is the story of two children finding out the meanings of things. Before I go on, a word of warning. Grimm stories, the ones that weren't changed for little kids, are violent and bloody. And what you're going to hear now, the one true tale in the Tales of Grimm, is a violent and bloody as you can imagine. Really. So, if such things bother you, you should probably stop right now. You see, the land of Grimm can be a harrowing place, but it is worth exploring. For in life, it is the darkest zones one finds the brightest beauty and the most luminous wisdom. And of course, the most blood. All right, so we're going to start with Faithful Johannes. Once upon a time in a kingdom called Grimm, an old king lay on his deathbed. He was Hansel and Gretel's grandfather, but he didn't know that, for neither Hansel nor Gretel had been born yet. Now hold on a minute. I know what you're thinking. I am well aware that nobody wants to hear a story that happens before the main characters show up. Stories like that are boring because they all end exactly the same way, with the main characters showing up. But don't worry, this story is like no story you've ever heard. You see, Hansel and Gretel just don't show up at the end of the story. They show up, and then they get their heads cut off. I just thought you would like to know that. The old king knew he was soon to pass from this world, and so he called for his oldest and most faithful servant. The servant's name was Johannes, but he had served the king's father and his father's father and his father's father's father so loyally that all called him Faithful Johannes. Johannes tottered in on bowed legs, heaving his crooked back step by step and leering with his one good eye. His long nose sniffed at the air, his mouth puckered around two rotten teeth, but despite his grotesque appearance, when he came within view, the old king smiled and said, "Ah, Johannes," and drew him near. The king's voice was weak as he said, "I'm soon to die, but before I go, you must promise me two things. First, promise that you will be as faithful to my young son as you have been to me." Without hesitation, Johannes promised. The old king went on, "Second, promise that you will show him his entire inheritance, the castle, the treasures, all this fine land, except for one room. Do not show him the room with the portrait of the Golden Princess, for if he sees that portrait, he will fall madly in love with her, and I fear it will cost him his life." The king gripped Johannes' hand. "Promise me." Again, Johannes promised. Then the wrinkles of worry left the king's brow, and he closed his eyes and breathed his last. Soon, the prince was crowned as the new king. He was celebrated with parades and toasts and feasts all throughout the kingdom. But when the revelry finally abated, Johannes sat him down for a talk. First, Johannes described to him all the responsibilities of the throne. The young king tried not to fall asleep. Then he explained that the old king had asked him to show the young king his entire inheritance, the castle, the treasures, and all the fine land. At the word treasures, the young king's face lit up. Not that he was greedy, it was just that he found the idea of treasures exciting. Finally, Johannes tried to explain his own role to the young king. I have served your father and your father's father and your father's father's father before that, Johannes said. The young king started calculating on his fingers how that was even possible, but before he could get very far, Johannes had moved on. They call me faithful, Johannes, because I have devoted my life to the kings of Grimm, to helping them, to advising them, to understanding them. Understanding them? The young king asked. No, understanding them, in the ancient sense of the word, standing beneath them, supporting them, bearing their troubles and their pain on my shoulders. The young king thought about this. So, you will understand me too? He asked. I will. No matter what. Well, under any circumstances, that is what being faithful means. Well, understand that I am tired of this and would like to see the treasures now. When the young king stood up, faithful Johannes shook his head and sighed. They began by exploring every inch of the castle, the treasure crypts, the towers, and every single room. Every single room, that is, save one. One room remained locked no matter how many times they passed it. Well, the young king was no fool. He noticed this, and so he asked, why is it, Johannes, that you show me every room in this palace, but not this room? Johannes squinted his one good eye and curled up his puckered two-toothed mouth, and then he said, your father asked me not to show you that room, your highness. He feared it might cost you your life. I'm sorry, I need to stop for a moment. I don't know what you're thinking right now, but when I first heard this part of the story, I thought, well, what, is he crazy? Maybe you know something about young people, and maybe you don't. I, having been one myself once upon a time, know a few things about them. One thing is that if you don't want one to do something, for example, you go into a room where there's a portrait of an unbearably beautiful princess saying, it might cost you your life, is about the worst thing you could possibly say, because then that's all the young person will want to do. I mean, why didn't Johannes say something else like, it's a broom closet? Why, you want to see a broom closet? Or it's a fake door, silly for decoration. Or even, it's the ladies' bathroom, your majesty, best not go poking your head in there. Any of those things would have been perfectly sufficient as far as I can tell, but he didn't say any of those things. If he had, none of this horrible, bloody events to follow would have ever happened. Well, in that case, I guess I'm glad he told the truth. Cost me my life, the young king proclaimed with a toss of his head. Nonsense! He insisted he be led into the room. First he demanded, but Johannes refused. Then he commanded. Still, Johannes refused. Then he threw himself on the floor and had a fit, which was very unbecoming for a young man the king's age. Finally, faithful Johannes realized there was little he could do, so wrinkling his old malformed face into a wince, he unlocked and opened the door. The king burst into the room. He found himself staring face to face with the most beautiful portrait of the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life. Her hair looked like it was spun from pure gold thread. Her eyes flashed like the ocean on a sunny day, and yet around her lips there was a hint of sadness, of loneliness. The young king took one look at her and fainted dead away. Later in his room he came to. Johannes hovered over his bed. Who was that radiant creature? The king asked. That, your majesty, is the golden princess, Johannes answered. She's the most beautiful woman in the world, the young king said. And Johannes answered, yes, she is. And yet she looked almost sad. Why is that? Johannes took a deep breath and replied, because, young king, she is cursed. Every time she has tried to marry, her husband has died. And it is said that a fate worse than death is destined for her children if she should ever have any. She lives in a black marble palace topped with a golden roof, all by herself. And as you can imagine, she's terribly lonely and terribly sad. The king sat straight up in his bed and grabbed the front of faithful Johannes's tunic. And though he stared into the old man's face, he saw only the princess's ocean blue bright eyes and her lips ringed with sadness. I must have her. I will marry her. I will save her. You may not survive, Johannes said. I will survive if you help me, if you are faithful to me, if you understand me, you will do it. Johannes feared for the young king's life, but he had understood the young king's father and his father's father and his father's father's father before that. What could he say? Johannes sighed. I'll do it. It is widely known that all the Golden Princess's days of loneliness, the only thing that gave her any modicum of happiness was gold. So Johannes told the king to gather all the gold in the kingdom and to command his goldsmiths to craft the most exquisite golden objects the world had ever seen, which soon was done. Then Johannes disguised himself and the king as merchants and loaded a ship with the golden goods. They set off for the land of the Golden Princess. As their ship's prows split the sea, Johannes tutored the king in his part. You are a gold merchant, your majesty. The princess has always loved gold, but these days it is the only thing that gives her joy. So when I bring her to the ship, charm her not only with your gentle manners and fine looks, but also with the gold. Then perhaps she will be yours. When they landed, the king readied the ship and tended to his merchant costume, while Johannes, carrying a few golden objects in his bag, made his way to the towering ramparts of the black marble, where the Golden Princess lived. He entered the courtyard and there discovered a serving girl retrieving water from a well with a golden bucket. Pretty maid, he said, smiling his kind but unhandsome smile. Do you think your lady might be interested in such trifling works of gold as these? He produced two of the finest, most exquisite golden statuettes that man's hand had ever made. The girl was stunned by their beauty. She took them from Johannes and hurried within. Not 10 minutes had elapsed before the Golden Princess herself emerged from the castle holding the statuettes in her hand. She was as gorgeous as her portrait, more so in fact. As she greeted Johannes, her golden hair flashed in the light, her ocean blue eyes danced with pleasure. Still around her lips, there was sadness. Tell me, old man, she said, are these really for sale? I've never seen anything so beautiful, so fine. Faithful Johannes bowed. But there is more, fair princess, much more. My master's ship is full of such wonders, and they can be yours if you will just accompany me down to the harbor. The princess hesitated for a moment. Since her last husband-to-be had died, she had not set foot outside the palace, but the allure of gold was too strong. She threw a shining traveling cloak over her shoulders and followed Johannes to the boat. The young king, in disguise as a merchant, greeted her. Her beauty was so stunning, her sadness so apparent and so tender that he nearly fainted again. But somehow he did not. And she smiled at him and invited him to show her all the treasures he had brought to her fair land. As soon as they had descended below the deck, Johannes hurried to the captain of the ship and, in whispered tones, instructed him to cast off from shore and set sail for home immediately. Now, my young readers, I know just what you're thinking. You're thinking, stealing a girl. That's an interesting way of winning her heart. Allow me to warn you I'll warn you now that under any circumstances, stealing a girl is about the worst way of winning her heart you could possibly cook up. But because this happened long ago in a faraway land, it seems to have worked. For the Golden Princess came back up to the deck and saw that her land was far away from her. At first she did indeed protest, and fiercely too, that she'd been carried away by low-born merchants. But when one of the merchants revealed himself to be a king and revealed that in addition he was madly in love with her, and when besides Johannes assured her that if she really wanted to she could go home, but she couldn't take the gold if she did, the princess realized that, in fact, the young king was just the kind of man she would like to marry after all, and decided that she'd give the whole matrimony thing one last shot. And they all lived happily ever after. The end. Are there any small children in the room? If so, it would be best if we just let them think this is really the end of the story and hurry them off to bed, because this is where things start to get, well, awesome, but in a horrible, bloody kind of way. And that's where we're going to stop. All right, so if you are interested in continuing this and finding out what the real story is of Hansel and Gretel, and as we've already been told, their heads get chopped off, sounds a little interesting. You can definitely continue reading this by checking this book out. We have print copies available. We also have it as an e-book so that you can read it as a digital copy, whether that's on a phone, a tablet, a device, your computer, or you can even get an e-audiobook, and then you can download it and listen to it, which is the same as reading. So then you can take it with you if you're listening to it on a phone, in your car, if you're listening to it on a device. It's a great way to finish reading the book. And I will tell you, this is also part of a series. So if you happen to like this one, there are a couple more in the series that you can keep reading the story and see what happens. So if you're into things like this, which not only is this fantasy, but the way that they cut in, and you can see like the text gets a lot bolder when they talk to you. I actually really like that and find that pretty funny. So if you are very interested in this, please continue reading, and let's find out what we're going to be reading next time. All right, so we just finished our fantasy book, so we're going to be finding out what we're going to be reading next time. So here we go. Harper's back here helping. Ooh, adventure. That one's exciting. I always love a really good adventure book. All right, so next time we will be reading adventure. So don't forget, if you go to evpl.org, you can find all of our resources there, our schedule for things that are coming up. If you go to our Facebook page, our YouTube page, you can like, subscribe, all the good things, and then be notified whenever we add something new. You can come into our library locations now and visit us. And if you have any questions or would like any recommendations, we would be happy to help you find things to read and do and enjoy. And I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. So thank you again. I will see you next Friday with a new adventure book. Bye. And then Harper back here says bye.